Hello, everybody, and thank you so much from wherever you are for joining me for this session. We're going to look today at how to plan a structured and enjoyable online EFL lesson for our primary students. So I'm going to be covering the idea of digital training for our little ones, how we can help them to use their computers well, the expected behaviour as well online. Then we'll look together at how to plan a class and some ideas you'll need to think about. I'll then talk you through some ideas for how to make reading and listening tasks enjoyable all together. And then finally, I want to show you some fun activities that I still do with actual props that are next to me here that still work when you're teaching online. So we're living in quite an unprecedented year. We've had to face many issues with regards to our teaching. And here are the 5 sort of main issues that I think that are affecting us right now. First of all, environment. We've had to change where and how we're teaching. When we've been teaching face-to-face in academies or classrooms, we were in complete control of the room, where the tables were, where the students sat, what was on the walls. But now we're all in our little mini environments. You're teaching from your house, their students are at their houses. And so this is something that is no longer in our direct control. But what we can control is perhaps the online experience and what our students are seeing there. But obviously, when our students are at home, they've got perhaps other siblings passing by, other family members getting involved. This really is kind of beyond your control, so don't worry too much about it. Instead, sort of focus on the things that you can control, that lesson design. Our structure is different. For example, the way that we would start a class or the way that we might teach something and get our students talking in pairs, that's changed as well. With access to technology, our students are all working off of different things. Some are using laptops, some are using tablets, some have faster Wi-Fi than others. And so this also throws up a whole host of problems. We, as I said before, have to really think about how we're going to teach these classes. And a lot of the success comes from the planning stages and thinking about what our students can achieve whilst they have this limited time with you, and perhaps what they need to do by themselves on their own, either before or after the class, in order to get the most out of the syllabus this year. And then finally, a lot of self-regulation. So the teacher is not able to walk past a table and automatically help a student or to encourage someone to pay attention. Instead, the students are having to mute, unmute, wait their turn. And this is a really big thing for our primaries. So let's move on to the first idea here of this digital training. Personally, I use Zoom and PowerPoint almost exclusively. I don't generally tend to go onto other kinds of web pages. And I think a big key thing for a teacher is practice the technology yourself before you give a class. So for me, when it's Zoom, I log on as the teacher on my laptop, but then using my mobile phone, I then log in as a student. And then I practice. I share my screen. I see what the students can see. Do the pictures need to be bigger? Does the font need to be bigger? What happens when I share the whiteboard? What does it look like? What happens if I want to link to a web page? What does that look like? So I practice a lot myself. Another good idea is to prepare a how-to handout to send to your students before the academic year begins. This is how to log on. How do you find the mute unmute button? How do you find the turn camera on button? All these kind of troubleshooting ideas. You can cut out a lot of problems by sending your students a how-to guide so that they can have a bit of practice with mum and dad before the lesson begins. I would say with your primary students, take the first couple of classes to practice the necessary features that they'll need. So we're going to practice this now ourselves. This is an idea that I got from my colleague Chris Rowland recently. For example, now in the chat box, I would like you to type the letter Y, meaning yes, and N, meaning no. And I'm going to ask you a question. Have you done any sports today? Type Y for yes and N for no in the chat box. Okay. Now I'm going to ask you a numbers question. How many students have you taught today? Type the number and press send. It could be 0 if you don't teach on Friday. It could be more than that. Okay, great. So if we now transfer this to classes with our primaries and we ask them more primary-based questions, what are we doing? We're automatically showing them where the Y key is, the N key, putting the cursor in the chat box, opening the chat box, typing in numbers. These are the basic tools that the students will need to communicate with you in a lesson. So that's what I mean by take the first couple of classes to practice this. Think about some activities that you can do that are not too much for them to handle. Use signs to help you communicate what you want. So as we know, primary students, very visual. So you might be saying all the time, please mute, unmute. And if you accompany it with a little sign, makes it very visual. And it's also easier to single students out as well. So if all of them have muted, but little Maria hasn't, you can say, Maria, Maria. And then she knows exactly what she has to do. So here are a variety of signs that you might want to cut out, color in. They're quite focused on Zoom because, as I said, that's the platform that I use. But this is a nice way to help your students to also see the buttons themselves, see what they have to see on their screen. So we talked about expected behaviour at the beginning. It is important that our students know how they should be acting in our classes, whether it's face-to-face or online. Students really enjoy having boundaries set for them so that they can feel relaxed. They know up to what limit they can go because they like to have good praise and good feelings in the lesson. They don't want to feel lost or worried that they might make a mistake. So here's our expected behavior, for example. We've got a couple of classics, please use the chat box, mute your microphones. The last one, ownership of work done on a collaborative document. That's if you have older primaries and, for example, they're all collaborating on a Google Doc or on a Padlet task, it's so that they don't erase another group member's work or they don't negatively comment perhaps on that work as well. So it's being respectful of collaborative documents. And I would say you need to show the rules every time you start a class from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. Because if a student breaks a rule, you can go back to the rules at the beginning and say, okay, we all promised that we would do this. And we know this. Whereas if you don't do that, a student will break a rule. And when you try to say, oh, please don't do that, they'll come more from a position of defense. Whereas if the expectation has already been set, the student knows automatically, okay, I have broken that rule. So I'll give you an example. This is the very first screen that I put on my PowerPoint when I share my screen with my students in class. This is the very first screen that they see before any activity as they're logging in. And it's the very first thing we say as well. And as you can see, the language is very positive. I'm saying, please remember to. I'm not saying, don't do this, don't do that, but reminding them to be very, positive, happy environment. And of course, the last one for me is super important. Remember to have lots of fun. You also might want to think about how can your students communicate back to you if they need a toilet break, if they haven't quite understood your instructions, they want to ask you a question. For me, I teach an hour online, so toilet breaks are a real thing. And some of you may be only teaching for 15 minutes to half an hour, where you can say that toilet breaks are not necessary. So think about, are the students going to hold a sign up for you? Are they going to raise hands button? Are they going to type to you? Think about how they're going to communicate with you. So when we were teaching face-to-face in a classroom setting, it was a very multilingual environment. What I mean by that is that more than one person at the same time could talk. You could have pairs talking, 6 sets of pairs, and that was okay. lots of people talking didn't necessarily interrupt the dialogue of another pair. But as we know, when we teach online, that can't happen. If more than one student speaks at once, we can't really hear what's going on. It gets very messy. If you're lucky enough to be teaching in Zoom, you can put students into breakout rooms to do tasks, which is lovely, but perhaps you're working with another application where that's not possible. So it becomes much harder for students to answer all at once. If you're trying to teach phonics and sounds, to have your students all unmuted and trying to give the sound back to you, it really doesn't work. It's very messy. So, for example, if you are teaching phonics, I would say, go through the sound, have the sounds and some example words, but all your students are saying it and mouthing it at home, practicing it aloud, but on mute. And then one by one, you can unmute your students and make sure that they've picked up those sounds. With that being said, if they're waiting a long time for their turn, it should be praised and turn taking should be worked on. Yeah. So keep an eye as to who is already patient at the beginning of the first few weeks of teaching. They could be one of the last to be chosen, but then the others who are a bit less patient, you have to keep every class putting them a one more position, one more waiting position, so that they get used to turn taking, and really praise the ones that are at the end. Thank you, Maria, you were the last one to answer. Thank you so much for waiting and well done. Some activities you can ask the students to be more in control of that turn taking. For example, you could ask John a question, he answers it, and then he nominates his friend Mary to answer the next question, and she in turn nominates her friend Anne to answer the next question, and so on. You just need to keep an eye on who has spoken, because children are more likely to choose their friend, and some people might repeat. And then for me, what is absolutely invaluable is that next to me, I always have a list of the names of the students in my class that day, and I keep a tally as to who has managed to have some speaking time, so that it's as balanced as possible to give everybody a fair opportunity to speak. Right, so let's move on now to the structure of the lesson. Be a master of your platform and don't get flashy. Right. What do I mean by this? It's quite an achievement for primaries to log on to whatever platform it is and to follow your lesson without being sent to yet another web page to do a game, or yet another web page to do a collaborative task, and there's something over here, minimizing screens and maximizing screens. It's really off-putting. Don't feel under pressure to be so spontaneous and fun all the time that you have to go to different websites. Be simple. Master your platform. What can your platform do? For example, in Zoom, I know how to share screens. I know how to do the whiteboard. I know how to do a poll. Yeah. So all these nice little features that make the class, come alive a little bit more. So that's what I mean there. Be a master of your platform. Practice it. In your planning, don't be too ambitious. What we used to be able to get through is impossible to get through now. For example, if you were teaching a course book and you were teaching 2 pages, that would probably in the old days have taken you perhaps 1.5 classes, 2 classes, depending on how long you're teaching for. Now that same amount of work takes much longer. So you're going to have to sacrifice some activities that aren't absolutely essential to achieving your aims. And don't be afraid to do that. So I'll give you an example here. An exchange of 600 words requires about 6 minutes for complex group tasks in face-to-face settings. So to speak 600 words when you're talking with a group takes about 6 minutes, while exchanging the same number of words by collaborating online via Google Docs, for example, would take, how long do you think that would take? It actually takes 1 hour. Now, this was a study that was done for adult students, so you can only imagine there's even more time for primary students to make the same amount of words in groups on an online collaborative task. So we can't possibly get through everything. You're going to have to cut out some of the material. Focus the first few weeks of the academic year on learner training. Sacrifice tasks in your syllabus, in your lesson plan, in order to encourage good behaviour. Okay, it's well worth making sure that students know what is expected of them and the consequences of not doing something, rather than letting the problem sit and fester and then later on you're still having to deal with it. If you can nip it in the bud in the very first few weeks, by encouraging good learner training, then later on you'll get through so much more material because the students are very well trained and they know what's expected of them. I always start the class after we've got the rules. I start the class with singing time, or previous vocabulary review, or some TPR, which is total physical response. So Simon says, or teacher says, or put your hands on your head, put your hands on your nose, stand up, sit down, those kind of things. Because it's very easy for a student who's just running a few seconds late to join in without interrupting the class. And once everybody's there, we take the register. As I said before, primaries are super visual. So if you're going to use something like PowerPoint, share your screen and make it nice and visual, lots of pictures, lots of model sentences, lots of colors, to help them to understand. Also, type out your instructions as well as speaking them. I think that to do activities that last anywhere between 5 and 7 minutes and then swap it out for another activity is the perfect way to keep the attention there. And the students also themselves need to know where they're going and how long they think in their mind the class might be. So if you put the aims up at the beginning, it helps them to know where you're going today, and it helps them to be aware of the progress of the lesson. And the aims don't have to be very complicated. For your little ones, it could simply be, today we're going to learn a new song, we're going to watch a video and answer some questions. Okay, and there you go. But as a teacher, a lot more is happening than that. But at least the students are getting excited about the lesson. These 5 aspects here really helped me when I was planning for my lessons online and in general, actually. This is from a blog, and the blog address is at the bottom here. And I use this as a template to help me with my planning. So the very first thing when teaching a student is activating. So activating previous knowledge, activating what they might know about a topic. Explaining is the teaching part, introducing something new and making sure the students understand what's happening. They then practice that, making mistakes, seeing things for themselves. Reflection then comes later on, where the students are trying to process what they've learned, trying to use it. And then the last part is a review. A review could be playing a game of new vocabulary or grammar in the next class or a few classes later. It could also be working on an online collaborative task where students are expected to use the new language. So I'm going to show you an example now of a lesson from Pop Tropica English Islands, level 5, so older primaries. And this double page spread, the aim of this double page spread is to introduce there is, there are, and its negative forms. So it starts with reading in context. Then it moves on to identifying locations of countries in the world. Then there's listening to help students with the pronunciation of there is, there are, and taking the information from the listening to make some sentences. Then listening again to another task to keep practicing. And finally, writing a bit of personalization. What has your country got? So it's pretty much impossible to get through everything here. But when you look at it in those 5 levels, it helps you to make smart choices as to when are you going to introduce these things, how, and what is okay to leave out. So this is an example lesson plan here, and I'm going to talk you through this in little stages now. So on the left side, you can see the 5 aspects that we're thinking about: activate, explain, practice, reflect, and review. And then the next column is what the teacher has to do during this time. Anything in green, I would like the student to do this at home, before the class or after the class. And anything in pink is what we're going to do together whilst online learning. So I'm going to ask them to start with the map activity. Then I'm going to go into the there is, there are in context and the listening. They're then going to reflect and do some sentences at home. And then they're going to come back to the class and work on an online collaborative task as a part of the review process. And in this lesson plan, you can email this to the students and the parents. There's a column for parents as well, what they can do to help their child. And very important, it says here, supervises homework, but child completes alone. And then they're there to give the answer key when the child has finished. Then it's the action of the pupil. Again, so there's a nice reference here, but you want to remind your students at the end of class what they need to do before the next class. And then the last column is the resources that the student will need to bring to the lesson. And it also helps you to remember your planning as well, what you will need to make. So let's look at that now. So this is the handout that was sent to the students before class. So they did their own matching and they looked at some key words here that were going to come up in the listening and were a potential block for students to understanding the task. Then together in the lesson, we looked at the two texts together, and then after explaining the concepts, we then practiced by blocking out the key words from the text. And then we also did the listening here, the wild holidays, so that we could hear the language in context. That was then the end of the class, all of that. And the students were then asked to reflect at home, and they had to write 4 sentences, practicing the new grammar, using the information from the listening task. And then the review happened a couple of classes later. They worked on an online collaborative Google Doc where they had to provide 6 sentences about what there is, there isn't, and there are, and there aren't in their country. And it was really lovely because the second one there was there aren't any camels, but actually there are camels in Spain, in the islands next to Africa that Spain have. There's lots of camels there. So it was a nice little discussion thing. Okay, so thinking about the lesson plan itself, it's a good idea to look at your tasks and to think about how to make them more challenging or to make them a bit easier depending on the mood of your students. Sometimes students come to the class a little bit tired. Sometimes they get tired during the lesson if they've really been concentrating on something new. Or sometimes it might just be a bit easy for some students and they need to up the game. So for example, if we're doing there is, there are, and let's say I'm showing pictures of a waterfall, for example. If I just show the picture, the students will have to generate the whole thing. That's the hardest thing. But to make it much, much easier, we can put the starting sentence for them. There is a, and then they go with waterfall. We could have missing letters, so they're practicing the vocabulary waterfall as well as there is, so with some letters. We can show extra pictures to help them. You can even show the word waterfall if you want to concentrate on the there is, there are. And you can also be silly teacher and accidentally show the answer if the students are struggling. So for example, if you remember this activity from the book, if I can see that my students are kind of getting a bit confused and a bit tired, I can say, oh no, that's the real, oh no, what did I do? I pressed a button and that's the answers. Everybody, don't look. And of course, they're then going to look, check their answers, fill in the ones they don't know. And then teacher finds the right button and we go back to the right page. So you can, have fun with it. It doesn't matter if they can't get everything perfect, making mistakes, noticing things. That's learning, isn't it? Some of you have started this academic year, but having not even met your students face to face. So it's quite hard to build that community, but it is very possible and very doable. So here are some tips for you here. Positivity. Yeah. So the community does come from you and your warmth. You know, students will want to be in your class if you are that positive, encouraging teacher, not super strict or super fierce looking, shall we say. So lots of praise, lots of going for it. And if someone does break the rules, the positive reminders, you know, please remember to use the chat box for English, not for anything else. There's language like that. No competition. So when I first started teaching, I really relied on competitive games to get my students interested in the lesson, and also to encourage my students to be really focused and to want to complete a task and to want to use the language. So I'd pit one group against another group. And then as I carried on teaching, I actually realized that this wasn't necessary. The students were quite happy to play a game, do an activity, because the activity itself was interesting, and that winning points just didn't really matter. It was winning the praise of the teacher. Well done, you got that answer right. Great, good for you. So, and I think online is the perfect place to sort of move away from that idea of competitiveness, because it's really hard to implement. They're not there. And because students are operating kind of by themselves in their own space, if they then get an answer wrong because they haven't been able to collaborate with someone, you know, it's all their fault. And that's a big weight to put on a child if they get an answer wrong for their team and they lose a point. So instead, just have interesting activities and asking your students to participate. You know, if you get something right, you know, you can do a silent, do a little dance party, thumbs up. There's lots of other ways to acknowledge good work. I think the good community as well is to do with fairness. So as I said before, the rules of the class so that we know where we stand, keeping that tally sheet so that you know who's answered, so that nobody's dominating the conversation. And this idea of domination can be carried over to the chat box as well. There are some students who can type faster or who can pick up things faster than others. And when they're always the first one to type in the chat box, it can kind of rob the others of their thinking time. And if it happens all the time, then those students tend to sort of sit back and not even bother. So you can introduce this idea of delayed typing and response. So, for example, you ask a question, but you have your signal to say, you know, type, but don't press send. So you could make a sign, you could have the instruction on your PowerPoint, you could have a hand signal. Yeah, so whichever way it is, ask a question and then give it a few seconds and then say, okay, everybody press enter now. And then all the answers come to you at the same time. Students can get to know each other by preparing a question for their friends and having their friend answering it. I also make a get to know you fact sheet. So I make this in my face-to-face classes and I have made it online as well. So this is a little A4 sheet of paper with questions that I've designed and spaces to draw pictures as well. You know, it depends on the level of the primary that you're teaching. And I'll get information like how many brothers and sisters they have, what's their favorite flavor of ice cream, what's their favorite kind of sport. And then what I do is I read aloud. It's a mystery person of the day, and I read aloud the information. And can the students guess who I'm describing? So this person's favorite flavor of ice cream is strawberry. And this person has 2 younger brothers. This person also has a dog, and so on and so forth until we guess the student's name. And then that student helps me in some way that day. The student can choose a song that we're going to sing, or can choose a final activity game, and so on. Makes them feel very special, and we've learned about them. You can also introduce an idea of show and tell. And you can either, if you're teaching where you can only have one student talking at a time, then you rotate week by week who is showing and telling, or you can use breakout rooms in Zoom. What I mean by show and tell is prepare before class your favorite green object and you're going to tell us one or two things about it. I'd like to move on now to approaching reading and listening online with your primary students. I'm showing you some really fun activities that you can do for both reading and listening. So as you can see, I've put in bold here the word text. Text, I'm referring to a reading text or a listening text, okay? So the first thing is to build up a bit of interest and prediction and get that vocabulary coming through for your students. So one fun activity is a slow reveal of a picture. What can students guess about the story you're going to do? So it could be that it's a story from a course book, in which case there's a little picture that goes with the text. It could be the cartoon from a course book as well, in which case choose a picture and do this. It could be a guided reader. For example, Pearson has a wide range of guided readers from primary all the way up to adults. And so you might want to show a picture from that. If it's a listening task, again, listening, sometimes you see the cartoon in the books, you can take the picture. Sometimes listening doesn't come with a picture in the book. So what I do is I cheat it a little bit. I imagine the listening text is about two people talking about their dog. I'll go online and find a generic picture of two kids with a dog, and I'll pretend it was them that was talking, and I'll get that picture going instead. So there's ways around it. But for example, this is a guided reader from the Pearson website, and I've covered up the picture. But you can see a little bit there. So I want you to try and guess, what is the story? Or what can you see? What do you think? And then I reveal it little by little. If it is a book that you're holding, it could be a book from your house, you can do the same thing with paper. Okay, so I reveal a bit more. Oh, what can that be? Yes, as we know, there we go. It's Bambi. So even though it's a fairly simple front cover, we can get all that lovely vocabulary for body parts, colors, and so on, because that's tricky to learn the word deer and ears and nose and tail and hooves and things like that. So there already you can start introducing that lovely vocabulary. Before you read as well, what you might want to do is get your students to think. Have two sets of words for students to sort out on the screen. Which ones go with the text? So here, the word deer would probably go with Bambi because he is a deer. But witch, maybe there's a witch in the story, we don't know. A fish, probably not. There might be a talking fish, and so on and so forth. So getting your students to think about what words they might see. And you might want to make them a bit more obvious or a bit more difficult depending on the age of your primaries. If words are tricky, just do it with pictures. Take a few pictures from the book or show a few vocabulary pictures that you grabbed from an internet page versus pictures from another story. If they're even older as well, start introducing sentences. Type out some key sentences from the story versus key sentences from another story. Can the students sort it out? And what's nice is once you've read the story, you can go back to this PowerPoint, this page where they've sorted the words out, and you can say, were you correct? Okay, so what about as we're reading? So I personally like telling a story if I can. So I like to read along with my students, and therefore we often stop, check, give our ideas, predict what's going to happen. We also play vocabulary games, like especially something tricky or something key. I'll say, put your hands on your head when you hear this word. And if they're much higher level, I'm pushing their language as well, saying, can you describe this word to me? Can you draw this word for me? Can you give me another word for the word happy? Yeah, so pushing their language there. If it's a story that they're listening to, or a story from the book that comes with the audio, that's fine. Just pause it every now and then and do the same kind of activities. And then after the reading and listening tasks, you can do the classic activity, put the action in order together, get your students to think about what might be happening next in the story. Could they tell you some predictions? Could they make a cartoon of the next chapter? Could they do a little bit of writing for you? And then this idea of comprehension questions versus reaction questions. So for example, comprehension questions tests whether or not the student has understood the text. So for example, a comprehension question would be, what did Bambi do after he saw the butterfly? Okay, whereas a reaction question is using your imagination to understand the emotion or the complexities of the story. So for example, a reaction question would be, if you had to buy Bambi a present for Christmas, what would you buy him and why? Okay, if you had to describe Bambi in 3 words, what would they be? So it's more coming from the student's experience and understanding. Okay, so for the last part of this session, I would now like to talk you through some fun activities that I do that still work online. And so I'm going to start with flashcards. I have my flashcards here. A lot of these activities you can also do via PowerPoint, especially if you animate some things on the PowerPoint as well. The nice thing about your flashcards is that you're able to manipulate them quite quickly and go break the rules as well if some students are having some difficulties. So here's some tasks now. First of all, what is it? So if you're introducing it, you simply show it and ask, what is it? Yes or no. So imagine if I'm showing a card and I'll say peanuts. And the students will have to say yes if it is or no if it's not. So peanuts, they'd be typing yes. Honey, they'd be typing no, this is jam. Fish, so they'd be typing no or saying no. They can correct you as well. Spin it, so yes. If you've got your flashcard, show it really quickly. What was that? Did you see it? And they have to tell you. You can also raise it from the bottom as well. First person, who knows what that is? Oh, like that. So just playing with the cards. A slow reveal is the same sort of playing. Can you tell what it is? We take one flashcard, we put it in front of the other. Slow reveal. What is it? Oh, I think it's upside down. Here we go. What is it? Slow, slow, slow. Ah, it's popcorn. Well done. Left or right. So this is where your board will come in handy. But again, like I say, you can always do it on PowerPoint. If you have a flashcard here on the L and a flashcard here under the R, yep, and you say jam, then the students have to say L for left or type in left because the jam is under the L. If you don't have a whiteboard like I do, all you need is a plastic pocket and some card or paper to make it firm. And as you can see, it works perfectly like a board and cleans like one. So you don't need to spend lots of money there. Close your eyes and take one away. Yes, so for example, if you've got, let's say we've got some different cards here on the board. So I'm using blue tack and I'm putting them on the board now. Okay. My 4 cards here. Okay, I ask my students, or I can even turn off my camera, but it's quite fun to get your students. Close your eyes, close your eyes, close your eyes. Okay, open your eyes. What's missing? It was the peanuts. You could also have your students close your eyes, close your eyes, close your eyes. What's different? Okay, so there's lots of fun games there that you can play with your flashcards. Sentences and spelling. Yeah, so anagrams always work nicely as well. So for example, writing out the anagrams and the students have to tell you what vocabulary you're revising. Peanuts in this case. Draw the word and guess. Okay, so go nice and slowly. And again, your students will have a plastic wallet, I'm sure, at home and some paper, so they can play as well. So you can hand control over to them. But I go in 3. So for example, 1, 2, 3. And I get my students to guess. I think it might be, it could be. Next one. Next one. Next one. Now, I'm not the world's greatest artist, but that's fine because what I'm concentrating on is the language and the suggestions that they're going to offer. I've actually drawn a rather rubbish looking hamburger here. The students can then tell me that. They can use language and say, teacher, it's not very good, and so on. As long as they're using the language in a natural way, that's perfect. And also mixed up sentences. So for example, if you're doing there is, there are, you know, writing some words here. There is some popcorn. Yeah, and I've given them a bit of help as well by indicating the capital letter and also the full stop there to know which is the word to start with, which is the word to finish with. Again, you can do that on PowerPoint too. Bingo. So imagine we've been looking at these vocabulary words of fish and peanut and jam. I'll have all the words on the PowerPoint. I'll ask my student to take a piece of paper at home, fold it into 4. And as you can see, it's nice 4 spaces. And I ask my student to choose 4 words. And then that's their bingo board. And they tick off the word when they hear it. Some speaking fun. Yes, backs to the camera. So for example, one student looks away from the camera or turns off the camera or looks away from you, yeah? And you show one thing to the rest of the class. And then when the student comes back, the other students have to describe it to them. You can nominate them. So to stop the idea of everybody speaking at the same time, you can show the picture and then you can say, okay, Martin, you start describing. And then he starts to describe and then you say, thank you, Martin. Now, Clara, you carry on. So the students don't know when they're going to be called upon. So they're always ready. They could also draw it for the student as well. And the student has to watch all the class and see if they can guess the word. Preparing a question for your friends. So we talked about that earlier, about encouraging individual responses by asking a question. The mystery box is also lots of fun to get students to use their imagination and to tell you what they think. So I've got a mystery bag, which very handily came from Amazon in a birthday package a while back. So I'm reusing that. And so I've got this, it's about this big. What could that be? So the students are giving me some suggestions, and I've given them some language to help them by saying, I think it's maybe it's can look in. Oh, it's a bit squishy. It's round. It's squishy. Smells good. It's very tasty, and so on and so forth. And then finally, someone will guess Satsuma. You can also do the same thing with foil so that they can see a bit more of the shape. And I think giving them some choices as well. So in the chat box, you can try and get your students a bit more obvious, perhaps with that shape there. Perhaps you can see what I've covered up with foil. Get it nice and close to the camera there. Okay, so students can see it from all angles. Sometimes I might accidentally rip the paper so they can see it, and then we reveal so that you can see at home what it was. And it was the elephant there. There you go. Okay, so you don't need any fancy boxes. You can just use foil. And then class mascot fun. This is a great way to get students to generate sentences and to practice grammar and vocabulary that you've been studying. So this is our class mascot here. This is Mac. And Mac goes in different places around my house and we generate sentences from that. For example, here, he wasn't feeling very well during the health chapter. So he had a cold. So we were giving him advice, what he should and shouldn't do. This was him preparing his breakfast. So then the students wanted to know, what's he going to put on his toast? What does he have with his toast? And then this is Mac preparing for Christmas. And has he been good this year? What kind of things is he doing to prepare for Santa? And so on. You don't need a fancy toy. Anything can be a mascot in your house. You just have to put a face on it. So for example, you can draw a little face on one of your things in the fridge or in your fruit bowl. And again, asking your students, what's his name? What's his personality? Where does he live? Where's he from? All this rich, rich language. And the students can also suggest what Mac can do next. You know, would Mac like to hang out with the cat? I have a cat here. Would Mac like to go somewhere? And getting lots of things like that. Mac also comes out when the students are also perhaps feeling a bit restless or a bit tired. Mac will come out and change the dynamic. So the last thing I want to say is I'd like you to practice the art of forgiving yourself. When you first started being a teacher, you were inexperienced, you didn't know what to do, and you learned on the job. Yes, you had training, but it is different than when you apply it. This is new for us as well, online teaching. So please don't be so hard on yourself when you realize that things go wrong. You will make mistakes. That is how we learn. We teach our students it's okay to make mistakes. It's a good thing. So why doesn't that apply to us? Don't be too hard on yourself. Things will go wrong and you'll learn from them and you'll be a better teacher for it. So just in those moments where it all goes a bit chaotic, it really isn't the end of the world, but you'll know what to do next time. Okay, so please practice forgiving yourself. So in today's session, we have looked at digital training for your little ones, the expected online behaviour. We looked at a structure of a lesson, what we need to think about when planning, what the students might need to do at home. We then looked at some fun ways to approach reading and listening tasks together. And then I showed you some things that you can still do with props or with a PowerPoint to make your classes come alive. So I'd like to say a big thank you for joining me in this session. And I'd like to invite any questions now. Thank you.